Welcome to the NEWSHAMI'ah podcast. This is your host, Jack Gaines. NEWSHAMI'ah is a product of the Civil Affairs Association and brings in people who are current or former military, diplomats, development officers, and field agents to discuss their experiences on ground with the partner nations' people and leadership. Our goal is to inspire anyone interested in working the last 3 feet of foreign relations. To contact the show, email us at capodcasting@gmail.com or look us up on the Civil Affairs Association website at www.civilaffairsassoc.org. I'll have those in the show notes. Please welcome back Grant Newsham, retired Marine Colonel and author of When China Attacks, A Warning to America. Grant came on the show to discuss the state of the Japanese Defense Forces and the PRC threat. This is the second in a 2-part episode, so let's get started.
Well, tell me about the threat. What are you seeing?
It's China, led by the Chinese Communist Party. They built up a military which is just gradually but steadily expanding its reach and its coverage. And it is, compared to, say, 2020, now instead of just being able to operate a little bit off their coast, they can reach Guam, Hawaii, and onwards. The Chinese military does intend to develop into a force able to operate worldwide just like the U.S. can. And their ship numbers, they got more than we do, something like 350 versus our 290.
Well, the Army has more than the Navy. It doesn't mean that they're a successful flotilla.
Well, fortunately, in terms of quality, they're pretty good. And they know what they need to do, and they're getting better. For some things like carrier operations, they're not at our level yet. But if you look at the speed at which they have developed, they're in pretty good shape. But let's just say the South China Sea, which is 1.5 times the size of the Mediterranean. Whenever U.S. ships go in there, and we do publicize our transits and operations and exercises, for every ship we put in there, the Chinese can match it with at least 10.
Wow.
And that doesn't include ground-based and air-launched anti-ship missiles, for example. So if the Chinese pick their spot, pick their timing, I wouldn't want to be the destroyer skipper who's got 20 anti-ship missiles coming at him at supersonic speeds, and he's got 8 seconds to figure out what to do. The point is they have had de facto control of the South China Sea since about 7-8 years ago. And yes, we can go in there, but once we're gone, the Chinese close back up and they've pretty much got it. Beyond that, it's harder for them, but they're steadily expanding their capability to conduct operations. It's a military that has its problems, like every military, but they are trying to correct them. They are building a military which they want to be able to defeat a country that has aircraft carriers, which is us.
Yeah.
In many respects, they are our equals. And have you ever heard a Korean War veteran who said he wanted to fight the Chinese again?
No.
And these was the Chinese of 1950.
Right.
It's a very different place today. And I'm not saying that they can't be defeated, but I'm saying it has built into an adversary that could give us a lot of trouble. And their intentions are to first dominate regionally and locally, and then push that farther afield to all the Pacific and beyond. And they're setting up the infrastructure worldwide with ports and airfields to do that. They're investing in long-range transport, these naval replenishment ships that you need to be able to operate the way we do, far afield. And that's their mission. And we have pretended until about 2017 that this wasn't the case. In fact, you couldn't even say China was an adversary. And guys who did, like Captain James Fennell, who was the head of intelligence at Pac Fleet, he was cashiered. He was forced to retire. The then administration hated him and got rid of him. And that's how bad it was. And I saw this all firsthand, experienced some of it, not as bad as Captain Fennell did. So we've allowed them to build up into a military that we had better take very seriously. And the Chinese do see this as a tool for their...
kind of a window of opportunity kind of thing?
The idea is if you have a powerful military, well, that's when you can lean on people.
Right.
You can intimidate people. You can dominate them. And they're happy with the psychological domination, political domination. Doesn't have to be occupying, but dominating. And they're in every field, from outer space, long-range missiles, undersea warfare, really putting a lot of effort into it. And there is a certain sort of ingenuity that goes into their operations. You'll often hear, well, they can't invent things. They don't develop things on their own. They just steal things or they reverse engineer.
That seems like a little bit of social racism.
It's kind of true up to a point, but look at us. The Yankee ingenuity was taking stolen British technology and making it better.
Yeah.
And so the fact they may not be as innovative as us, well, that sometimes it just has to be good enough. So they've got now a military combined with this desire for political domination, as well as considering their economic power as just as important as the military. And you see how successful that has been. When you have U.S. business leaders giving Xi Jinping 2 standing ovations last November in San Francisco, that tells you how successful they've been on the economic front. And the Japanese know they have a huge problem. You would often hear the Japanese military saying, one thing, Taiwan's defense is Japan's defense. But I've even seen they've done the calculations they did, like at which point the Japanese Navy would be outmatched by the Chinese Navy. And they had the date almost down to when it was. And our side, we were late recognizing this. We refused to.
Well, the problem is that the Chinese operations in the political, economic, and social realm have made it hard because they feed America what it wants. The United States is addicted to drugs and money, and the businesses want free access to cheap labor in order to build and create and export. And China's like, oh, you want that? Take all you want. And unfortunately, they exploit it to the point where our financial sector is addicted to Chinese money in dollars, as well as the amount of fentanyl and opioids that come out of Myanmar mostly into the cartels and into the United States and other target nations that the Chinese want to break down. When they're giving you something you want, it's hard to say no to it. And that's part of the why the lensing for China as a risk has been hard for the United States, because they keep seeing all the good things that they wanted happening. Then to turn and say, no, that milk is poisoned is hard. It's really difficult for this nation to do.
Yeah, you've described it well. Ultimately, the military part of the fight is extremely important, but it's almost a sideshow to the other activities, the other fight that China's been waging for the last 30, 40 years, almost ever since we opened up to them. And that has been generally referred to as political warfare, with components being economic warfare, financial warfare, drug warfare, which is the word the Chinese use. So all this fentanyl that's been pumped into America for the last decade that's killed up towards 1 million Americans, almost all of it comes from China. And they know exactly what they're doing. And so every year they're taking like the equivalent of 2 or 3 divisions off the battlefield. You've destroyed neighborhoods through successful economic warfare. Drive 30 miles up the road to Baltimore. Go to Sparrows Point, where there used to be steel mills. And now you have Amazon fulfillment centers at best. But you've seen just the gutting of American society, the so-called working class, the Rust Belt. And this was done intentionally, and it was in large part Chinese economic warfare directed at the United States. Then you have cyber warfare as well. You have cyber espionage, well beyond what countries normally do.
Oh, yeah.
But they have used it very effectively. And the Chinese just recently put out their new fighter that's called the J-35.
Right.
That is a dig at the Americans because it is based on stolen blueprints for the F-35.
I saw a picture of it, and at first I was offended, and then I thought, how long have we had the F-35 out?
I don't know. It's been a while.
It's been a while. So I put in the comments, hey, welcome to a 20-year-old platform.
Unfortunately, it's referred to as leapfrogging over stages.
Sure.
Yes, it may take them a little longer, but they will hopscotch through it. And so I'd take it pretty seriously. Their Y-20, the long-range transport, is basically the C-17. And they've just been immensely successful at this sort of espionage. And then at the same time, we've done nothing to push back on them. Then there's the propaganda angle of this, which really the good old Jesuit meaning of the word just means to explain yourself or articulate your position so people understand it. They've been very successful at getting Americans to buy the Chinese line that China's rise is peaceful. China's never attacked anybody. It's not true. All great nations do this, so who are we to complain? America has its problems too. Who are we to complain about the Chinese taking live organs out of Uyghurs and prisoners of conscience. And we've been able to convince ourselves that we not only can we not do anything, we shouldn't do anything. This is changing, but you can see we were very late getting started. And this has all been done without firing a shot. Chinese economic inroads, which leads to political influence, is in, for example, South America and Africa. Just immense how fast that has come, how solid it is. On the Pacific Islands, something similar is going on. And, look at Western Europe, look at the difficulties the Germans have had weaning themselves off of this Chinese addiction. And as a result, they have been able to improve their position politically, psychologically, economically. And they've been able to do this globally without having to use their military.
Right. Why would you? If you can win economically, politically, why would you apply a military force?
Yeah, that's the idea, is you don't want to. So our view of warfare is like a 100-yard dash, where the two sides come to the line, shake loose, and then someone fires a gun and it's game on. To the Chinese, the war has started long ago, and you're wearing down your opponent, you're weakening his ability to resist, you're creating chaos in his own country. There's a word called entropy, which is just breaking down. It's entropic warfare. It's a word that sometimes gets used. For you're breaking down his ability to resist. And at the same time, of course, the Chinese are building up a military, which is pretty serious. Yes, it's not showing up off of San Diego just yet, but places closer to China, it's much more of an issue. Japan knows the problem they have with the People's Liberation Army and its parts, the Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia. So you are seeing more of a Chinese presence. And the point is, when the time comes, you may not even be able to resist if the Chinese have done this other sort of warfare.
I think it's similar to Crimea, to where when the Russians moved in with their proxies in Crimea, the message going out at that time was, oh, that was always a part of Russia. So this is just recorrecting an error, is what everyone kind of had an attitude towards. And no one really saw it as an offensive by the Russians to take territory, because the mindset was different. And so it's kind of that same entropy you're talking about, because no one responded. No one helped Ukraine defend itself. It was just a foregone conclusion. This was always a part of the way it's supposed to be, and they accepted it until the new invasion occurred.
That's exactly what it is. It's mental warfare. You're attacking the mind. You're attacking how people think about things. Some people use the word cognitive warfare.
That's a very fancy word. Yes.
The popular word. Yeah, you're attacking the mind. And so you can see how well it worked. And the Russians had a much poorer hand to play than the Chinese do, because we do so much business with China. And you see how hard it is to do things like ban TikTok. We can't even get that done.
India got it done. We haven't got it done.
Like 72 hours, if that, for the Indians to do it. We can't do it. And you see how Chinese successfully use what they call lawfare, which is using our own legal system. And the idea is that you get proxies, influential foreigners in your target country to actually do your bidding for you. The Chinese have like 5 aces to play. The Russians might have 1, but you can see how successful the Russians have been just with that.
Yeah, their hybrid warfare options are a little different. But I think the one thing about the Russians is when they play out their aces, they are willing to go down to blows. We haven't seen it with the Chinese yet. We've seen it with hybrid options where their fishing fleets have rammed ships and their Coast Guard have rammed ships.
Well, you're right about the Russians, but the Chinese, they understand that the term gray zone paralyzes Americans. We hear it, we have no idea what to do because of our view of warfare being until the shooting starts. That it is, we're not really at war, there's still hope of working something out. That has been our rote response for all these years, is to not get the Chinese mad, don't provoke them. And we have convinced ourselves that we have to have Chinese help with fill in the blank. North Korea, transnational crime, nuclear weapons, proliferation, climate change. And therefore, we cannot challenge the PRC because we won't get their cooperation. So we've effectively handcuffed ourselves. But when it comes to that so-called hybrid warfare, it's not all that complicated if you recognize what it is and how it fits into China's behavior, its strategy. But you also would do well to attack from other directions where they're particularly vulnerable. And that is where you take advantage of the fact, for example, the Chinese currency is not freely convertible. which means that outside of China, nobody really wants Chinese money. It's like the script at a high school carnival, where you can use it to buy caramel corn and go on the rides.
But you can't go to 7-Eleven with it because they don't care.
That's it. Nobody wants it. So choke that off, and China's got some real problems. Another is the just thoroughgoing corruption of China's ruling class. And most of them have wealth overseas, foreign bank accounts, real estate, relatives with green cards. Lots of them operate businesses overseas. And this is illegal.
Right. Their own laws say it's illegal.
And this is where that really scares them. Because in this 2011 or 12, New York Times and Bloomberg actually put out some good stories about the overseas wealth of China's top people, including Xi Jinping's family. I've never seen a reaction from the Chinese like that one. This bothered them more than anything else we've ever done.
With the boat bumping and the rammings, what if suddenly about 30% of all the hidden bank accounts that we know of get an audit notice? And we just start doing signaling by, look at these things we don't like. Oh, suddenly 40% of your listed banks are being audited. It may go away, it may not. We'll find out.
That's one way to do it. Another way to do that, and be a tactical thing, is say you were to release, say, every Friday, say at 1 a.m., 1 o'clock or whenever, the latest on which of the top 50 Chinese Communist Party officials, and make sure it reached everywhere in China. The thing that the public really hates is this corruption, and by the top dogs. That is something that really bothers them. And you note that the Chinese leadership is very willing to have the average Chinese citizen suffer, absorb any amount of punishment, and they even talk about it. But when it's personal, then they see it very differently. And this is one of the few ways to really make it personal for them, is to capitalize on this corruption. So when we talk about dealing with gray zone operations, if we just try to match it, we're probably not going to be all that successful, because they have more ships, they can be in more places. And
They have more bribing money than we do.
but expose that. They can do that. Have we made a concerted effort to expose Chinese bribery, the illicit payments, the corruption that they put into everywhere they go? Everywhere there's a Chinese presence, you have corruption of the society, the political class as well. And do we ever target that? Do we consider it a priority effort? I don't even think we consider it an effort at all. Exposure is the one thing that has a huge effect. This is why investigative journalists get killed. It's why, like, Irish gangsters try to murder them, and in Malta they get blown up, because they're effective. And it's the exposure, which is the thing that makes it very hard for corruption to work. And that's where I think we have some real opportunities to make it very clear what's being done. And this is something that if you expose it, you can really capitalize on it. Just make it too hard to do this. And it also gives oxygen to the honest people in a country. It gives them something to work with, to take on these repressive regimes, these corrupt regimes, administrations, and get rid of them and replace them with honest people. I've never met anywhere I've been over the years, where people like to be cheated, where they like their leaders to be corrupt. I just haven't met it. I've been anywhere. But often there's just nothing you can do. But when you expose the stuff, it really has an effect. And that's where I think government resources could be effectively devoted. And particularly once you get, say, local reporters in on it, once you get the honest locals in on it, the thing gets a momentum. And that's where I think we could be very effective. Corruption, as you've mentioned, that's really is the grease to everything the Chinese communists do globally. Take it away, and then take away their access to dollars, convertible currency. And they've really got some problems. But they have played their hand very well to date. But in some ways, it's a house of cards. I don't think it's that hard to take on, but the longer you wait, the harder it gets.
Any other thoughts on Japan or Taiwan or China or U.S. policy in the area?
In regards to U.S. policy in, say, Asia, there really is a desire that the United States stays around in Asia, that it maintains its military might, and is able to effectively safeguard what you call freedom, consensual government. Because you go around the region, nobody wants to be dominated by the PRC. But they do have a huge advantage particularly economically, that they're seen by leaders and business people in a lot of these countries as really the source of some wealth, some prosperity. And we would do well, for example, to see the fight as just as much an economic one as a military one, because we could build up our military, rebuild it, and we could have 800 ships in the Navy and still lose if we don't fight on these other fronts. If countries just say, look, we don't want you here because we're doing too much business with China. And that's where the U.S., along with its friends, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Indians, the Australians, we would do well to operate together more and to see the economic front and the political warfare fronts as a priority effort as much, if not more, than the military.
Our commercial sector still practices it quite a bit.
They have a role to play if they're properly harnessed. But you do note that these days you don't see the Yankee trader that used to exist. But it used to be you'd run into Americans everywhere trying to sell something, trying to do business. Not so much these days. And we've almost ceded the far-flung parts of the world because, the return on investment isn't enough. It's not an attractive enough proposition. Well, then let's make it one. Plus, you do have, say, the Japanese, the Indians, who are much better at operating in these places. So put it together into a coherent plan. Understand what it is, political warfare, and not just block the Chinese political warfare efforts, but actually have our own campaign. And it really is worth doing some homework, I think, for a lot of people into what political warfare is. And one sees the opportunities, but it takes a certain type of person who's good at it. And I compare it, given what we're talking about, I'm going to say a tank commander versus a civil affairs guy. He's going to see different parts of the battlefield in a different way. And yes, sometimes you want the tank, but then there's this other part of it all that is almost like a liberal arts test. Here you have to figure out the motivations for things. You have to figure out how a society works. And then how do you appeal to it using the things that are parts of political warfare? And this is where you can really make some mileage. You got to have both. Make no mistake. In fact, if you're not able to destroy things and kill people, the civil affairs part isn't going to get you very far. But combine the two, and then you've really got something that's very hard to take on if you're the bad guys. We talk about defending Taiwan and how important it is, and it is, I think, indispensable that China does not take Taiwan and enslave 23 million people. If they did that, Asia would turn red overnight, as every country tried to cut the best deal they could. No country anywhere on earth would have much confidence in American promises that we'll protect them. But one of the ways to actually defend Taiwan is, yes, they could maybe use F-35s and long-range missiles and smart mines, etc. You do have to have all of this stuff. Is it enough, even, particularly if the other side says, okay, we'll absorb whatever you can send at us, but you're finished. But one of the ways that, say as part of this strengthening of Taiwan would be to give them a free trade agreement, to improve their economy to the point that the government felt like it had more money to spend on defense. You get a certain confidence in the entire society when they're more prosperous. The salaries are very low in Taiwan. Make it so people feel like they've got more money, they can buy a house, buy a condominium. And so it build up the economy, and that has a ripple effect throughout the society and on their military itself. And yet we didn't do that. And I think that's where we should apply some effort.
I was just at a conference about wargaming, and a lot of it was tactical, some theater operational level. One thing I pitched to the crowd and to the designers was to build a war game that is shaping up to the conflict, where you're engaging in hybrid operations, economics, political conditions, everything that drives towards that conflict or ends the conflict before a shot is fired. Because if we don't do it, we're not going to need a military, because as we saw in Georgia, military coup through proxies can happen, and pretty soon you don't have a partner nation anymore.
I think you're right. And it's essential that we start to understand this, that we think about it. Because you look at much of the debate about us in China, a lot of it is what happens when the two forces go at each other. And that's almost like, I think, like two hoodlums going up behind the Waffle House at 2 a.m. to see who's the toughest guy in Prince William County.
The Waffle House brawl.
There's, out back.
I love it.
But think of all the things that go into whether or not the two hoodlums
got there.
And, there's all sorts of reasons why. They may not.
Yeah.
Or that will affect the outcome, actually. None of them have to do with force on force. And that's so much of our debate on the U.S.-China military problem is that, well, would our Navy take on theirs, or their long-range missiles outrange ours? Yes, it's important, make no mistake. But it's only one part of the battle, and it's the last part. And if you look at the other part, say political warfare, and every part of that, then you have the chance, one, not to lose, but you can actually shape things to your advantage. But if you don't, and the other guy is the only one playing that, well, you're likely to find yourself at 2 a.m. outside the Waffle House, and he's actually ready.
Yeah.
We talk about bases, having access. Well, what if we don't have the access because Chinese political warfare has made it so the locals won't let us into a place?
Right.
They won't let us operate.
Like in the Solomon.
Well, that's a pretty good example. So that would be, though, I suppose, the equivalent of like one hoodlum can't get a ride to the Waffle House, but the other one can. And so we've really got to start thinking about these things from a much broader perspective. And it's unfortunate that we're reinventing the wheel here. But, the game's not over. It may be the bottom of the seventh and we're down by 6. And, we're the old Washington Senators playing the Yankees. You can debate how far we're behind. But at the end of the day, we've got a good hand to play. And I hope we start playing it.
Well, I appreciate you coming out.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for everything, Mr. Newsham.
Thanks for listening. If you get a chance, please like and subscribe and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. Also, if you're interested in coming on the show or hosting an episode, email us at capodcasting@gmail.com. I'll have the email and CA Association website in the show notes. And now, most importantly, to those currently out in the field, working with a partner nation's people or leadership to forward U.S. relations, thank you all for what you're doing. This is Jack, your host. Stay tuned for more great episodes. One CA Podcast.